All right, so here's part two of today's videos on capital punishment. This will be delving a little more into the specific arguments made by the two authors that you read for today, Berns and Nathanson, who are basically giving us kind of a point counterpoint on the value and the necessity of harsh punishments like capital punishment. So I want to start with Berns, who's talking about the importance of the law, and specifically what he's going to argue is that we need capital punishment, the death penalty, and we need other harsh punishments also, but he's zeroing in on this one, as a way to communicate to society the high importance of the law, obeying the law, and generally by obeying the law, adhering to the moral standards of a particular society. So for Berns, even though we know from the earlier things that we did in this class that the law and morality are not the same, right? We can have unjust laws, we can have things that are legal but not ethical, and vice versa. For Berns, the law's purpose is to maintain moral order, to make sure that people do what they're supposed to do, ethically speaking. So he also believes that people have to fear punishment in order to behave rightly. In other words, people aren't going to act correctly if they know that they won't be punished for acting incorrectly. So we're kind of back to our old friend Thomas Hobbes here under the social contract. Remember, Hobbes talked a lot about how you needed a very harsh, strong ruler to reinforce the moral norms that we create through a social contract. And without that mortal god impersonated, the person in charge of administering rewards and punishments with the law, people would not actually behave, because for Hobbes, if people think they're going to get away with something, they will try to do it every time. So Berns is kind of putting forth a similar idea that people need to fear the punishment that the law would bring in order to behave correctly, and that without the law, we will not have enough motivation among the general population to adhere to the moral norms, the standards for right behavior that all people ought to, in fact, adhere to. Berns also talks a lot about anger. That was a big part of his article. And you may have recalled some of the fallacies of argumentation when you were reading this. So we saw earlier in this class that relying on emotion and appealing to emotion is considered an informal fallacy. And what we mean by that is that if you appeal to emotion, if you talk about how you feel as a good reason for why you act how you do, or how something might make another person feel as a reason why they ought to do something, we know that's a fallacy of reasoning because it takes away from providing rational reasons for a particular course of action. So Berns is talking about anger, and he's talking about that as an important element of our social ideas about morality. But he is not saying that we ought to have capital punishment because things make us angry. So he's not using anger as a reason for acting. What he is saying is that when we feel angry at those who break the law, that tells us something. That tells us that we know an injustice has taken place, we're indignant about it, and we want something to be done about it. So it is a good sort of signal to us as individuals that something has gone wrong, but we're not supposed to act on our anger. The problem is the law is supposed to do that. And if the law doesn't do that, that's when citizens will act themselves. So a good example of this is the case of Johar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. A lot of people were very, very angry, understandably so, with the mayhem that was caused in the Boston Marathon bombing a couple of years ago here in the US. And the job of the law for someone like Berns would be to make sure that that person is held accountable, that our morally righteous anger is listened to, not to allow an angry mob to punish the person, but to say, okay, we know something very serious and it has happened and a very bad injustice has happened, and the legal system is going to deal with it accordingly. So for Berns, then, the legal order really exists to maintain the moral order. We have a set of moral standards that we as a society uphold, and our legal system is designed to make sure that people actually follow those moral standards by imposing punishments. So what he says on 215 is that the law must remind us of the moral order by which alone we can live as human beings, in other words, not like animals. And in our day, the only punishment that can do this is capital punishment. So there are two ideas here, right? The first being that the law is what sort of differentiates us from animals, takes us out of this animalistic state of nature that Hobbes depicted in his text. And Also, the second idea that is also very important to keep in mind is that the only way to do this for some very serious offenses is through capital punishment. So there are some things in here that you may agree or disagree with, and I encourage you to spend some time thinking about those two ideas. So we want to think about whether the law is the only thing keeping people from running amok, from doing just whatever they want to. In other words, is Hobbes right that we need harsh enforcements from the law in order to get people to behave correctly? And then, is capital punishment truly the only punishment that can do this, which is what Berns is maintaining here? Okay, so to go on to the counterpoint, Nathanson's argument against Berns is going to reject both of those ideas. So Nathanson's answer to those previous two questions is going to be no to both of them, that we don't need super harsh penalties in order to uphold the moral order, and the capital punishment is not the only way to have a just and ethical society. So Nathanson's argument is basically going to be very different. He's going to say that we achieve moral progress and create a morally good society by renouncing things like the death penalty, by saying that's not who we want to be, that's not the type of society we want to be like. And by doing that, we'll send a powerful message about the way in which our society values human life. So this is based on Nathanson's idea that there are inherent human rights that all human beings deserve just by virtue of being human, and that the death penalty takes those away. Now, these are rights that people have regardless of what they happen to have done. So what he says is, by renouncing our use of death as punishment, we express and reaffirm our belief in an inalienable, unforfeitable core of human dignity. In other words, even if someone's done some despicable things, they may give up certain rights that they once had as a law-abiding citizen, such as the right to roam freely. We might put them in jail or confine them in some way. But there are certain rights, such as the right to life, that all human beings have that they can never give up through any actions that they commit. These are basic human rights that everyone has, regardless of who they are or what they've done. So this is a stance that Nathanson is taking that's clearly going to be very different and lead him to a very different conclusion than what Berns talked about. So Nathanson is also concerned with deterrence. He's concerned with doing things and creating policies and laws that will deter people from committing bad acts. We saw that with Berns. He thought that the only way to really deter people was to have harsh penalties imposed by law. Nathanson's got a different idea here. He says by affirming human dignity and reinforcing our moral values, that's going to foster sort of a cultural ethos of respect for other people and respect for life. And by doing that, people are going to be less inclined to think that a good way to solve problems is by committing acts of violence. If the state doesn't do that, then that's not going to be considered a valid thing that's on the table by the vast majority of the population. Not everybody, right? We know that there are going to be some people who want to do something different, who think they're exceptions to the rule, who aren't going to go along with what society dictates. But in general, we want to foster a good moral order of respect for others. And for Nathanson, the best way to do that is to have a legal system that respects human dignity and basic human rights. So he does want to consider the question of moral monsters. Moral monsters is just a term we use to talk about people who are very egregiously unethical, who are beyond just the standard things that the average person does that may sometimes be considered immoral or unethical. So you probably recognize the two guys on the left, Hitler and Stalin. That's Osama bin Laden. And then on the right, we have Johar Tsarnaev. He's the one surviving Boston Marathon bomber who was just very recently here in the U.S. Sentenced to death for his role in that Boston Marathon bombing. So these are people that we might arguably call moral monsters, not because they're inhuman, they're clearly still human beings, but these are people who have committed acts that are so far beyond what a typical person is capable of or would do that maybe the anticipated objection is maybe at least for people like this, maybe these types of people are so bad that we ought to at least reserve the right to execute criminals or politicians. In the case of Hitler and Stalin, we at least ought to reserve the right to execute people like this because they're so harmful, they're so bad for society. Nathanson says no even to that. And the reason for that is that when we're thinking about this, it's not about them. It's not about these guys here and what they did and what they deserve. So Nathanson is not about retribution, right? He's not about looking back and seeing what a person did in the past that was horrible and wrong and holding them accountable for that. He wants to look forward and put forth laws and policies that reflect what we think is most important about ourselves. So for that reason, we have to consider who we are not just what someone did, but who we are as well, and how we want to differentiate ourselves from those bad people. So he says that we are going to commit to control ourselves in a way that the criminal did not. In this case, the form of self-control that we're talking about is controlling our desire to get that revenge, to exact an eye for an eye instead of taking the moral high road. So some questions to consider pertaining to these specific texts then that you want to think back about the first intro that I talked about, where I gave you some more sort of broader moral concepts and some information on what the death penalty looks like worldwide and in the United States. Do we send a message about our society's values through our legal punishments? In other words, can we look to what a society's laws are and get an idea for what that society's values are? If that's true, if our legal punishments reveal something about our moral values, then we need to look very closely at our legal system to make sure that what we're communicating is consistent with what we do in fact value morally. Do people need harsh penalties to behave rightly? In other words, do you agree with Hobbes and Berns that without very harsh penalties, people will take every advantage that they can? Is the death penalty the best response to egregious acts? Egregious acts are really terrible ones, like the ones committed by moral monsters, so-called. And that's the end of our section on capital punishment.